It's for all of them. One slide. Yeah. And then one side everyone. So that's what I mean. Everyone knows. Two slides just the titles.
And then we can.
You know this?
Yes. So,
This is the mic for the Q&A session.
Okay, excellent.
So we have two.
Perfect.
Will you need both?
I will do with my. Well, I don't know if you want to.
We put it on the table.
No,
and it's also for the questions.
It's just for the questions.
Okay, so we take one each. Yeah.
There's the microphones. You appoint people. I throw them the ball. The question.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a nice little feature. Yeah, perfect. On. Yes.
Right, I think we're just about ready to begin. So if you want to take a seat, that would be great. Hey. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this, particularly at the end of the day on a Monday. So my name is Nicolette Bartlett. I work at CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and I lead on all the work on carbon pricing. We have a very esteemed panel talking about something which to some folk is a very boring issue, but for us a very fundamental one, which is the issue of how you integrate climate risk into the reality of capital allocation, let's put it that way. We've got the perfect panel, I think, to discuss that today. We have from the German government, Norbert Gorissen, who is the head of international climate finance at the Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety. At some point, you need to make that name a little bit easier to get. Yeah. Lois Guthrie, who wears many hats and has been part of this discussion, I think, for a very, very long time, as a founder of the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and works for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development as well. And we have to my left Ed Wells from HSBC, who leads on their energy and climate infrastructure projects and financing. And we have Santiago Lorenzo Alonso from WWF, who leads on their finance for climate and energy. So a good mix of government, private sector, and NGO. So hopefully we can have a rich discussion today. The subject is really, how do we integrate climate risk and opportunity way so that capital is allocated? The key that has been, I suppose, the holy grail, or at least one of the holy grail conversations of the negotiations and the climate discussion, has been about how we shift capital at scale. And there've been much good work done in this space, and now we're in the conversation of really scaling that up. And one of the angles to this, which is what we'll be discussing today, is really about how this becomes part of financial decision making in a much more integrated and fundamental way, as opposed to just leveraging private sector action. You're actually fundamentally shifting the private capital through the way that it makes its normal everyday business decisions. And if you look at climate risk, it obviously comes in many ways. It hits the economy and can potentially disrupt the economy in many ways. One is obviously through physical risk, but then there's also what they call transition risk, which covers a broad range of risks and opportunities that investors in the private sector and governments need to be up to speed on. And it's a tricky one. It's ever changing. It's very hard to measure. But we're at the stage now where we need to measure it, and the work that continues and our panel will outline in terms of where the different sectors are coming from on this issue as to how we go about measuring and then shifting and mitigating some of that risk. And of course, at the same time, utilizing the opportunity that this transition can bring. All of you, or at least most of you, will know that central banks have been working on this, and through the Financial Stability Board of the G20, they tasked an industry-led group, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, working on the back of work that's been done by CDP and other SASB and other disclosure platforms around the world, looking at how companies, recommending to companies and to investors as to how they can integrate climate risk and opportunity into their investment and decision making. And this integration, they look at what's, I suppose, the kind of innovation in that space in the recommendations is that it's not just about looking back, but it's also about looking forward. And that it's integrated into your core financial reporting rather than something that's done separately to the financial and the balance sheets. And in that, they have recommended a series of, and we can discuss that more in depth on the panel, but looked at things like scenario analysis going forward. How do we go about doing that against a 2 degree or less than 2 degree, below 2 degree world? It looks at ways in which corporates and investors can integrate carbon emission pricing into their investment decision, and essentially calling for a type of stress testing for a wide range of private sector actors to test their current investment decisions against the transition to on the Paris Agreement to a below 2 degree future. I'm going to start with the government perspective first. So if I can turn to Norbert, obviously the German government is playing an absolutely fundamental role this year in terms of chairing the G20 discussions. We know that you've been at the heart of that in many ways for your government, so we're delighted to have you and thank you for joining us. And if you could give us a sense both where you think this is going, I think in the G20, but also within your own government, and then perhaps give us a sense of what finance ministers are currently discussing on it and what you are aiming to achieve at the Leaders Summit in July. Thank you, Norbert.
So good evening. Thank you very much for, first of all, inviting me for this very interesting and very important topic, and I'm happy to present here some thoughts. I would like to start first with the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement, as I guess everybody knows, has in its Article 2 3 targets. One is the temperature target, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, an adaptation and resilient target, and a target to shifting financial flows according to a low carbon and resilient development. And in order to implement that target, it is very obvious that all the discussion we have traditionally about climate finance is not making the point. So we really need here to have all actors working together. So public sector has to play its role, MDBs have to play this role, but in particular also private sector has to come into the play. And in that respect, I think, first of all, I really appreciate very much, and we are delighted to see that so many activities have been ongoing on the private sector side, and some of the people on the panel are representing that. But secondly, that the whole area has gotten momentum, in particular through the work around disclosure and around this new task force. So we think this task force is really preparing a very important piece of work. It will showcase very clearly how financial markets and real economy can identify the risk and barriers to shift finance closer to investments related to climate change. It could provide the transparency which then would allow for embarking in the transitions. It would help, hopefully, investors to finance this transition, and it would reconcile the tragedies of the horizons, which is between the needed long-term investments to achieve the targets of Paris and the short-termism of business cycle. Therefore, I in particular are delighted about the forward-looking element, which is a part of the task force, which looks at potential scenarios to be included in the strategy work of companies and financial institutions. So where are we on the German side? Germany has agreed. The German government has agreed on a climate action plan for 2050 that was agreed in November last year. It aims at achieving 85 to 90% greenhouse gas emission reduction. It includes sectoral targets for 2030, which is important, and it also looks to some areas of actions how to manage this transformation, and it identifies clearly that investments needed to be shifted forward, looking into social, ecologic, and just measures in this regard. And so the FSB task force is already mentioned in this German government policy paper. So we are working on that, and I'm quite sure it will be picked up by the new government after our elections in September. Coming to G20, so we're presiding the G20 at the moment. Chancellor Merkel has made very clear from the very beginning that she wants to send a strong signal to the outside world on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, acknowledging in particular the very important role G20 countries play, both with respect to their economic power, but also with respect to their emissions they prepare. And in order to do that, we have set up a new working group within the G20, the so-called Sustainability Working Group, which works for the first time very intensively on climate and energy within the G20. And we are working on an action plan of the G20 on climate and energy, and this action plan will include or should include also important measures in the field of finance. And at the same time, our finance ministers discussed 2 times already the ongoing work in the G20 of the Green Finance Study Group, which was launched and initiated by the preceding Chinese presidency. So we're very grateful for that initiative from China to continue this work, to welcome the successes achieved so far, and also on the task force of the Financial Stability Board. You may have noticed that there were some issues around that, and that the meeting in Baden-Baden in March could not agree on that. There was a second meeting of finance ministers in DC, in Washington, and there is a statement of the German presidency which has been published these days, which has very useful language. So it says, I quote here: "Finance ministers and central bank governors also thanked the industry-led task force on climate-related financial disclosure for its substantial work. They generally agreed with its draft recommendations on voluntary disclosures by corporates of climate-related financial risks, including the changes envisaged as a result of the public consultation process. They encouraged large listed companies to consider their recommendation on a voluntary basis." So, and the aim is to have a final report being presented right in time for the summit, for the G20 summit, which is in early July. And I hope we can anchor something like that also in the summit committee. Of course, it's a little bit too early to think about, to speculate about that. And in this regard, we are very grateful for the work of many organizations and financial organizations over the last days to come up with very clear statements that the financial sector is ready to go in this direction. I think that is really helping our efforts. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norbert. So I couldn't agree more in terms of this fruitful dynamic that is existing and needs to increase between the public and private, and it's probably the only way we're going to get there. Lois, if I can turn to you, you've been working on this for a very, very long time in terms of how you actually integrate these risks. What do you notice in terms of where we are now, and what do you think we need to do to go forward?
Thank you, Nikki, and hello, everybody. Yes, when I started about 2000, I think, working on how climate risk was to be integrated into corporate performance and their financial performance. And when we were a very small organisation at CDP, with all of our 5 members of staff putting letters in envelopes to organisations like Goldman Sachs, asking them to tell their investees to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, our CEO at the time, Paul Dickerson, said to me, "We're like audacious teenagers." But we know that audacious teenagers are very innovative. You know, they're the next generation of thinking. But now that the Financial Stability Board has become involved to create the recommendations on climate-related financial disclosure, it's as if the parents have come home and they're going to tell us in more detail what we should be doing. So as Norbert has said, the task force recommendations on disclosure require, they have 4 main disclosure requirements that companies set out how climate-related risks and opportunities are embedded in their strategy, how they govern climate change, how they take account of risks and opportunities of climate change, and they do define what these risks and opportunities are, and also how they should report on strategy, on their metrics and targets to do with climate change. As Norbert said, the final report of the task force will be issued in July. What's interesting, though, is there are 2 main things, I think, that depart from the way in which climate-related disclosure has evolved to date. One is that the focus is on climate-related financial disclosure, which means that the task force is really looking for the financial impacts and implications of climate change on an organisation, and even have suggested ways in which those disclosures are categorized according to financial categories, assets and liabilities, cost of capital, expenditure, and so on. They're certainly looking for how climate change is taken into account in financial planning. And this is quite a departure, I think, from climate reporting as it's developed to date, where it's been handled perhaps a lot by the CSR or sustainability department in the private sector, and will now need to, those organizations will now start to have to involve their finance and compliance departments. But although it sounds like it's going to be quite difficult, and there are many implementation challenges ahead, there's such a great degree of commitment to the task force recommendations. The We Mean Business Coalition has today published a statement setting out support for the task force recommendations. And they're calling upon the G20 and B20 formally to endorse those recommendations and to organise for some of the implementation mechanisms to be brought to bear, such as guidance and so on. Please look on the We Mean Business website for that. There have been statements from World Economic Forum leaders as well in support of the task force recommendations, and from investors. Broadly, they call for 3 main things. First of all, support for the Paris Agreement. Secondly, the introduction of economic measures that will support the transition to the low carbon economy, including carbon pricing mechanisms and fossil fuel subsidy reform. And thirdly, for there to be understanding and accounting for climate risks through support for the task force recommendations. But although there is this history, and there's a great deal of support in the form of commitments and written pronouncements from industry leaders, investors and others, it's not just about words. There's a lot of evidence of the actions that are being taken by various sectors. Business, for example, if you look at the Business Commission for Sustainable Development report, you'll see so much evidence in there of the real life actions that companies are taking to address climate change. The Low Carbon Technology Initiative in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for example. Investors, regulators, academics, scientists, and NGOs are, I won't go into it. There's enough evidence in the shape of reports, enough to tilt the Earth on its axis, I think, to show that there's action as well as commitments. Now, these combined have been called by UNEP-FI a quiet revolution. I wonder why that's quiet, and why, despite those commitments from the world's leading private sector actors and from all the evidence of action, why is it that we still ask ourselves, has enough been done? I saw a G20 Insight paper that said that the NDCs will consume about 70% of the carbon budget by, I think they said about 2020 or 2030. So why is it that we still fear we won't be able to meet these targets? And I'd just like to finish by leaving you with a few thoughts. We know from various analyses that investors are saying that they find it difficult to act on information, and this may equally apply to disclosures made according to the task force recommendations because of the lack of standards. They don't find the comparability and the understandability that comes from the standard setting process. They, of course, as Norbert said, there's the problem of short-termism as well. There's a problem of fragmentation where all of the activity that we see in this evidence that's so great and so insightful in the recommendations it makes is so fragmented that it doesn't add up to a coherent whole. So what are we going to do about this? Well, the State Street research that was done in association with Harvard University and Professor Bob Eccles is called Investing Enlightenment. Now, he sets out there the characteristics of enlightenment are that you have a vision of a better world you want, but then you have to get practical. You have to have some pragmatism to add to that vision. You have to combine the two. And if I were to try to make one recommendation that sums up, I think, what we see from the commitments and the action, it's that more infrastructure is needed to support all these commitments and actions so that they can be, so that there's coalescence around the highest common denominators of those commitments and actions, so that there can be coherence in policy making and understanding. And also perhaps that there is institutions that have the power to make real change happen and to help with this coherence and coalescence. There's been a wonderful report by UNEP again on the institutions that seem to have climate change and its integration into corporate practice in their remit, including the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the International Accounting Standards Board, and so on. And this report concludes that all of them have some of the subject in their remit. None of them have all of it. And as a result, at an institutional level globally, a lot of the good effort is falling down between the cracks of this fragmented action. So I think the one message I'd leave us with for discussion perhaps is it infrastructure we need? Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you, Lois. Given us much food for thought there, I think. Ed, let's turn to the actual private sector that we keep pontificating about here, and you're actually sitting here. So let's turn to you to give us your perspective. Banks sit sort of, I tend to think of them as sitting right at the heart. If you had to draw a systems diagram of the finance sector, at some point you bump up against a bank and then you bump up against a bank, and there's so many facets to a bank that are involved in so many parts of the decision making and the investment that is made in the finance sector. So you will have a multifaceted view of this. But what do you think? Where are we now, and what do you think needs to happen going forward?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me along. As you said, banks sit, I wouldn't say necessarily at the absolute center of the process, but certainly we're both, I would see us as users of the information that we hope to be disclosed, and also providers of that information. So we do have a kind of dual role. Off of HSBC as an institution, we're an international institution present in many countries, with the number of corporate clients running into the millions. I'm only saying that just really to emphasize the scale of the problem we face, if you like, in ensuring that when we look to manage our clients through the transition from high carbon to low carbon, that we have a comparable way of doing this. So, you know, I believe in the power of markets. I believe in the power of economics to drive the process. But what those markets need is good quality information to avoid mispricing of risk and misallocation of resources. And so we need to know which assets are at risk of being stranded, and then we can help our clients through the transition. So we've done a little bit of work of our own on disclosure. We commissioned an independent survey last year. We're repeating it this year. The results will be out in a few months. This survey surveyed around 300 institutional investors, around 300 corporates. Many of these people would have been our clients, but this isn't a list of our clients. This was an independent survey, and they looked in the US. We just didn't have the cover. They didn't have the coverage for that, but Asia, Middle East, and the EU, and they found quite a disparity in attitudes to disclosure. So while there was growing awareness of the importance of climate-related disclosure, there was not by any means a kind of comparable state of play at the moment. And so for us, looking at our lending, looking at our own investment decisions, we are, you know, that's the kind of information that we face. But there was a real agreement from the investors who were surveyed. This is around 300 investors. Over 80% of them said they wanted to allocate more investment into low carbon, but the information on which to base those investment decisions was lacking. So, you know, you should see this as an opportunity, as Norbert said at the beginning, to make the money flow in the right directions. This is not about necessarily cutting off finance. This is about making sure that we're supporting the right sectors, and that we have as a comparable a basis as we can have to prepare to make those decisions. So we need the sort of framework that the FSB task force potentially offers us. We know it's not perfect. They admit that it's not perfect. We've seen some criticisms about, particularly around some of the metrics, and that's the sort of thing that needs to be debated, and we need to find out what those metrics are. But I think the role of the private sector should be really to get engaged in the process, and we are engaged in the process. We're actually, one of our former colleagues is a member of the task force, so we've you know, as an institution, invested, if you like, in the outcome. But the real challenge, I think, will be how we go about tackling implementation. But maybe that's something we want to spend a little bit more time on later on. But you know, at the moment, we still have a global kind of public sector consensus that we need to do this. I think the private sector broadly recognizes that that's the case. But the private sector probably, in our view at least, should have the lead role in implementation. I think if we wait for a kind of mandatory legislative response by the official sector, that's going to take a very long time. So we think that the private sector could really start to drive this really relatively soon. I would say just one point on kind of engagement. I mean, we're engaged in this. We're a large institution, as I mentioned, and some of our larger clients are doing this thinking already. But then there's a whole other tier of institutions, firms, you know, non-financials, who really will need quite a lot of help and guidance to understand how they disclose, and more important, you know, what the information will be used for. I would say the sort of consultation for many people was the first one. It's probably the first time that a lot of people had actually heard of it. And our own survey I mentioned, which was December 2016, still showed a relatively low level of really awareness of what all this was about. So I think there's a real job for all of us to kind of raise the profile of the issues, and this kind of discussion and these kinds of discussions I think are going to be really important, because we need to help our clients through this transition, and they need a good sound basis on which to disclose to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And yeah, let's definitely get down into the nitty-gritty of that implementation in our conversation afterwards. Santiago, be very interesting to hear your perspective. So the NGO perspective, you know, why is WWF focusing on this? Why do you think it's important? And what do you think needs to happen in terms of implementation?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to apologize, Manuel Pulgar Vidal, that he is the lead of the climate energy practice. He should be here in my place. He couldn't make it, but he's really, as I will explain now, he's into this subject, because it's dear for us for many reasons. The first thing is that we think this is an exciting development, and also I will explain. I want to explain why WWF is in climate, because it's the same story that the financial sector is going into climate. As Norbert may agree, environmental people has at the core of their business biodiversity, water, forests, etc. And at some point, we realized that climate change, if we do an excellent work on environmental protection, climate change can get rid of it at some point. So we got into the climate world because it is in the top of the risk, of systemic risk for our work. For financial institutions, it's the same story. They have a business, they have a core business that is really away from climate, but suddenly they start to realize that climate can get rid of their core business. So we have the same story, even we come from different fields. So that's the linkage with this development that we really are interested on. So always the discussion here in the UNFCCC is about a certain amount of money, but we have ambition from the start that shifting the regions was important, and you cannot shift the way financial institutions do things or take decisions unless you realize that they are not incorporating the parameters. They have an excellent tools for risk assessment, but they are not incorporating important parameters. And this work from the task force is critical for that. And the main thing that is curious for us is that we see a value for financial institutions overall. Obviously, there is a value for us. And I know Lois and Annette both talk about that. A really great mechanism if they act with information. Information is basic for market and money allocation. And then if you lack of some critical information, as climate information is, you're taking bad decisions. Obviously, the sphere of what the listed corporations information can have is not enough. There are a lot of the world that we care of, ecosystems, that they don't feed into listed corporations. So this is an amazing tool, a great tool, is not enough, but it will be useful. It will be really useful for the footprint of most of human activity, and that's really important for us. So the work of the task force for us is a market opportunity for industries to make better decisions for themselves and obviously for the world. In that sense, for us, it is important to develop further scenarios and to benchmark scenarios. Why I say this? Because right now, corporations are making assumptions, and they used to live in the best world of all. So if I am a large corporation and I have real estate, but I also have fossil fuel reserves investments, I took that nothing will happen to the real estate that are in vulnerable places of the world, and I take for granted that there will not be stranded assets. That's the best world in both sides. No, you have to assume. You have to assume one or the other, or you're in a 1.5 or you're in a 4 degrees scenario, and that's important. In this disclosure that the financial the task force is pushing, they are asking for corporations to define the scenarios they are assuming, and then therefore they are you have to explain why you take this scenario, and then you make your risk assessment. And that's important, not to live in a utopia where everything is good into scenarios and you play with them. So that's really a fundamental issue that we need to push for, and we want to have the 1.5 scenario because that will show that there is a lot of value for all, for ecosystem, but also for economic in preserving the best we can the world we live in right now. So for further work, we are really we don't know exactly how, because the G20 is still a question mark, but we want this work to continue because of what you mentioned, Ed, on metrics. We need to advance on metrics. We need to advance on scenario building. We need to advance in many specific tools because we believe this is a technical issue. So the debate in the G20, because there is a divide in the G20, there are countries really interested well, they live from the oil and gas, etc. And there are countries that they import, and their balance sheet is always pressured by these imports. You have this divide, but it is not a divide in what we are talking about now. It's information, and the decisions will come with a political background that is valid, is legitimate, but the information should be granted on the best available information, the best available methodologies, the best available metrics, and scenario building. So in that sense, the message for the G20 is this is a technical work and it's unfinished. They should support this work to keep going. The institutional maybe is not so important, but we need to have this in a high level. And I agree with that. The implementation phase, because it's a challenge because we are running out of time. So it is clear that things are getting worse, and this is a tool, among others, that we need to be in place as far as possible. If it is with private and public pressure or initiative, obviously each country is different, but to be aware that this needs to be in place, and the public sector and the private sector agreeing what is the best way forward, that is what should happen. I think I'll leave it there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Santiago. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and just ask a few questions of the panel, and then we'll open up for discussion from the floor. Norbert, I'll turn to you first, just to stick to the encroaching death method of asking questions. This is a tough one, so you probably won't be able to answer. But are you confident for the summit itself? We know that that's going to be a geopolitical interesting moment, given some of the world leaders at the moment, and I'm sure that is something that the German government is hyper aware of, and you've got so many people supporting you, speaking to you, asking you right now. I can imagine the pressure is intense. Do you feel confident? What would make you increase your confidence that we are going to get a communique that actually supports the TCFD and welcomes the TCFD recommendations and recommends their implementation? And in particular, what would help you from, folks sitting on the panel, folks represented in the room? What is it the German government could do with between now and then that would really help enable your leadership in that space, from investors, from companies, from NGOs?
Yeah, it's indeed a tough question because formally I can't answer that as a representative of the German government, and it's not really my level who can share views on that. I can only share my personal view, and personally I'm confident because things have moving slowly in the right direction. So I mentioned that in March, the G20 finance minister meeting was perceived as really being a moment where people were a little bit shocked because two sentences, which were really not very far going, were not accepted. The one which welcomed support of the Green Finance Study Group, and the other one welcomed the work or the recommendations of the task force. So I said we had another discussion among finance ministers in April in Washington, and at least there's now language as a German statement which is published, which is giving it the right direction. It welcomes the work. It recommends to big companies to implement the recommendations. It also recommends to continue the work of the task force. So if we can have that, something like that, I think we are there. At the same time, we heard many voices coming up supporting this, and in particular voices from the private sector. So the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change sent letters to the G7 and to the G20. The World Business Council was active. I saw an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal with many corporations, not only from the finance side, but including from the finance sector, supporting that. And I also must say, the task force is just one element of what we would like to see. The biggest thing is really to have a recognition and continuation of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And we're not yet there, but I'm quite confident. And what helps is strong public support. I think it wouldn't be helpful to pressurize a particular country, but really looking where can we build on what we're hearing from them. I think in the end, what we are aiming at is moving us all in a more prosperous, in a more sustainable, in a more resilient direction. And I can't really see why anybody should be against that. So if we frame it that way, that it's really something for everybody, then I'm quite confident we can get there.
Good. Well, we'll sleep a little bit better tonight and then start stressing tomorrow again, hope. As we pick up the next.
That's my personal sentiment. So I don't know what happens over the next week. So don't be too assured.
Yeah, exactly. Lois, you mentioned the need for the institutionalization. So can you just describe that a bit more? Is that a new thing? Is there a new institution out there? Or is that the institutions that exist need to do something? What do you mean by that?
What I mean by it is that all of the good commitments and actions that are currently in the public domain are reinforced by an institution with the power to give them legs, basically. Because if you think of examples, you ask if it's new, not really. If you look at examples like the OECD's corporate governance principles, they're not fully international, but they represent the OECD members' view on how corporate governance principles should be. I think there are a number of things that we need to do before we get to that stage. We definitely need practical help. I always put myself in the place of a person in a company whose boss comes up to them and says, here's a new report by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It says we have to do 4 disclosures. Do it. I always feel for that person, and I think there's a great need for practical help to be delivered, and that's already available. That's already available from the CDP database. You can see good examples of practice. Even the Climate Disclosure Standards Board has a framework, and 300 companies use that, and essentially it's very similar to what the task force asks and what CDP asks. Of course, we also need technical help. This is where we start to address the thorny questions that are a bit deeper than what we can deal with on the practical level. And that would typically be done, certainly if you look at financial reporting, by one or more standard setters. We've got two standard setters mainly in the financial world, the International Accounting Standards Board that develop international financial reporting standards, and their US equivalent, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. So IFRS applies to over 100 jurisdictions now, and that's an example of where you get some institutional gravitas and coalescence around certain standards. So organizations typically like the OECD, the IASB, the IMF would not necessarily develop something, but would say we are an institution with international reach on related subject matter to do with finance and investment, and therefore we lend our support to these recommendations and the practical and technical infrastructure that has been developed by the private sector. Of course, in addition to that, there is some sort of cultural work to be done. And again, this is where international institutions are very helpful in endorsing the highest common denominator of action that's taken by the private sector. They can create a culture where that becomes the norm in the countries in which they have influence. And of course, leadership. Some institutions, private sector institutions, need to stand out above others to show the way, and certainly we have many examples of that in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So that's where I think the power of institutions is, Nikki.
Thank you, Lois. So there are some deeply technical institutions out there that we actually should be influencing and not just focusing our attention at just the G20 and other multilateral fora. Ed, turn to you. I mean, you've mentioned that the private sector should lead. And I know that we have, and Lois, you've also, mentioned companies taking a lead on this. And it is something that I know that all of the partners in We Mean Business are definitely working on at the moment, is trying to make sure that there are companies, once those final recommendations are published, there are companies who commit to embedding those into their practice going forward, because that will hopefully provide even more of a support for the G20, and then clearly it institutionalizes and sets that bar. I'm just wondering, is the information enough? You kept emphasizing the information, and then you mentioned the 80% of investors that want to shift capital to the low carbon. So are we going to have a world where, okay, this becomes the norm? Let's say the International Accounting Standards Board magically decides that that's it now. The suits of all this is the new accounting practice. And then you've got this consolidated set, and you've got folks working on asset level data, and you've got all these, you've got the information you need. It needs to be standardized a bit more, but it's starting to come at you and you're starting to process it. Are we going to have magically that 80% capital move? Is that enough, or what else is necessary?
Well, I thank you. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I mean, I think the task force themselves think of perhaps a 5-year program of implementation, and perhaps that's the realistic hope. Yeah, we certainly do see an important role for the private sector. How we organize ourselves is in a sense not necessarily the most important factor. I mean, I think the financial institutions, perhaps the financial private sector will perhaps take the lead, but we are really dependent on the non-financials also participating actively. And just on that, we are starting to see issuers and investors making a link between things like high ESG ratings and arguments around what that should do to the kind of price of credit. So specifics, I won't go into, but in effect, companies saying we have a high ESG rating, that can be help you to understand that we're actually a better credit perspective. Can we put these two factors together? So well, I think what I'm saying is that we're increasingly seeing economics rather than politics starting to drive the process. So that does really make the case for the private sector to lead. So whether that means individual trade associations working as a kind of hub and spokes model, there will be some countries, I think, that probably push faster than others. Perhaps the European Union will push ahead, as I mentioned, I think earlier on. You know, the EU does have has an institutional framework for relation at a multilateral level, but you know, that's quite an unusual place, quite an unusual situation. So rather than having lots of different versions of this framework taking 5 years to implement into national laws, this has to be done on a multilateral, it has to be done on an international basis. I think it has to be the private sector that really has an important role. That's not to say that we're not, like everyone here perhaps, really keen for the G20 to welcome and to support the task force work. But even in the absence of a really strong message from the public sector, I think the private sector will still want to make progress because, as I said, it's the economics now as much as the politics driving this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Santiago, it's the kind of the flip side of the question that I asked Norbert in terms of what do you think, what's the campaign around this? What do you see it yet? Do you see interest in this across the NGO community? What is the support that needs to be given to the G20 and then to these institutions? How do we campaign on an accounting standards board? I mean, really, right? How do we construct that narrative? Is there a narrative to construct, or do we leave it up to the business NGOs to take forward?
Thank you. Actually, we always think that all the issue of climate finance has to do with development strongly, and always the economic part and the political stand by different governments is if any campaign is we want to grow the economy in X%, that's like the saving part of the campaign. No, it is the comfort zone that we're going to get more of what we have, and we always think that climate finance is about development, is about a healthy development that really spreads out and introduces a lot of issues that usually are not taken into account. Actually, on this private and public divide perspective of the work of on risk assessment and this risk disclosure, we need to go back and remember that all of this in economics is externalities. And then if we are thinking about information, there are a lot of relevant information about sustainability that don't go into the markets. We need to be clear on that. So we need a public policy perspective on conservation, on resilience to climate change, and then work with the markets, not against them, with the markets, and make synergies on what public and private can make together the best. So in that sense, obviously Ed was referring to the European Union, and also we have the Article 173 in France, and we have the UK approach. We will have different approaches around the globe, and that is legitimate and valid. So how to advocate for that or to campaign for that? As I mentioned in the beginning of my exposition, we really think that we are converging with the financial work because this is a financial issue. We are very exciting that this is happening, but if I am an investor, I hope to be soon. I don't know where I will have the income enough to be an actor, an important actor in it. But if I am an important actor in investing, I would love to know where my money goes. Where do I get the revenue? What are the risks? Obviously, being blind and get revenue, get returns is wonderful. But at some point, that if you are really interested in what is going on with your money, you want to know more. And to know more is about that. It's about what the task force is doing, and we are witnessing negative rates, and then to get additional rates of return is going to be difficult. There's much more competitive the world. The opening of borders, the harmonization of laws around the world for investments are making much more harder to get additional return if you're not getting big risk. And so the risk assessment needs to be much more clear, much more. So from our point of view, campaigning is about and realize what you're doing. It's your job. It's not our job. Obviously, our job is this to be in place, but also the externalities to be considered, and that's something that we will continue doing. So, in that sense, how we can campaign for a rapid adoption of this. It's making the financial case is like the best thing. We are not maybe the best positioned to do that. But we will fight for that. We will fight that the financial world really understands that this is for their own sake. Obviously for their own sake, for our work, but mainly for their own sake of investors.
Thank you. And you mentioned wanting to become an investor. I think it's always important that often we think of the investor community or the shareholders, these amorphous, there's a bunch of suits somewhere, right? And they own everything and we need to influence them. It's not true. We're the shareholders in reality, in the end. If you have a pension, if you have an asset of any sort, and I think that's the next revolution, in my view, in the financial sector, is getting that dialogue out. And I think that the campaigning world, or at least the NGO world, should have because that's where the individual impacts this. So let's move to questions. We've got these groovy catch boxes, and they are microphones and handy toys for games, I think. Shirin will be chucking that around, so you not only need to have a good question, you need to also be able to catch. So any questions, comments from the floor? Over here.
My name is Ingo Pohl. I work for South Pole Group, and we are 100% committed. That's all we do, moving capital into the low carbon economy. We are around the world, also that I think a pretty good worldview. We're doing, carbon footprinting for financial assets, investment vehicles, to ease the flow of funds. Originally come from carbon credits. That's just the background. I want to, you had the big question about, we have commitments, but there's not more action. And you had the very good point about we need to actually make sure that there is littler or, less that can be done in care to negate the positive effects of those who want to do something about it, right? Which I actually think is a really critical topic. And my first question is, what are we doing about kind of like the incumbents, like those who have a short-term gain from not doing the right thing, those who don't want to be in the light, those who benefit by operating in the shade, right? And we see it everywhere. And, and those are, if I see how decisions are made about building another coal power plant somewhere, it's shady decision-making. It's driven by very corrupt processes. And what can we do to stop those people, right? So we're doing all of the hard work to get another solar park, 60 megawatts over here, but then below the radar screen, boom, 2.5 gigawatts of coal in Bangladesh, right? Huge impact. Or this whole thing about coal in, Indonesia, let's say, right? So that's one, what are we doing about the incumbents, right? So we have kind of all the goodwill, but that side, are we also covering that? question. And the second is, we see there is all of this money. I think that's the point that Ed made, that wants to go into the low carbon economy, and we get bombarded by requests, right? And what we feel, it's very hard to satisfy the criteria of like those big investors, because they want big, right? But the renewable economy is small, but many, right? And so there's a mismatch there in terms of, basically there's some need for aggregation in the middle. How can we satisfy the fiduciary requirement of a pension fund if what we have to offer is 100 small hydro projects, right? So how do we bridge that, and what are the ideas around bridging that? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question around what do we do about the dark side when we're trying to make things transparent, and the mismatch of scale in terms of the investments we need to see and the investors need to be able to scale up their investments into, and what we currently have on offer. Norbert, do you have any response to either of those two? And one of you is going to have to take the tough one. So I'm going to.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Good questions. I start with the second one. I'm not really from this disclosure and FSB, etc. community. I'm from government. I worked many years now in the field of traditional climate finance. So the question of the 100 billion and things like that. Here we're talking about the trillions. Then there is another community, which is the people who do aid, development cooperation, working with all those institutions around there. The MDBs, UN organizations, and the recent new kid on the block, the GCF. What I really think is there is still a lack of bringing those three silos of financial of finance in one room and talking together, because what you mentioned in order to bridge between the needs of institutional investors on the one side, which cannot deal with hundreds of small-scale projects, and those who are developing those projects and are seeking for capital or debt to finance that, is really the space where, for instance, MDBs have to come in, multilateral development banks. So what I identified is there's really a need to work much closer together in order to overcome these issues. And both sides have moved. Maybe the institutional investors, if they really want clean investments, green investments, long, stable, etc., and safe, then they may also have the need to go an extra mile for getting there, not just waiting that they get it in a way presented to them, which is the same way as they usually do investments. And on the other hand, the MDBs, they may take perhaps also an extra mile and providing a little bit more technical assistance, do a little bit more risky interventions in order to make that happy to be attractive for the commercial financial market. So that would be one consideration I have on your second question. What about the incumbents? I think the only thing I can really say is transparency. That leads also to the task force, but it's going beyond that. I think it's also really investigative journalism, NGO campaigning, things like that. So this should not be hidden away. So this should become open and transparent. And those who are speaking with two faces, they need to be addressed to it, because we have sometimes countries who are appearing as being, oh yes, we want to do all the action on climate, etc., etc. And if you go to another forum, you can see that that they are completely incoherent. That's basically, and they may even be corrupt. But even if you don't go that far, I think this incoherence is an issue more or less for every government, including from our own. I know that. So we're talking green on the one side, and on the other day, another ministry is really going the business as usual. So the only thing I can see helps is transparency, discussion, disclosing it, including with financial disclosure means. So colleagues here on the table have also some views on that. So that's not a question I only can answer.
Thank you. So I'm not going to get into the specifics necessarily of different types of power generation, but I would say, repeat the comment I made earlier, that economics, not politics, are starting to drive the change. I completely agree with you. There are lots of small projects, and we need to, if you like, reduce the barriers to, and that does mean either more investors getting, you know, their heads around infrastructure, for example, and understanding it as a sort of recognizable asset class. I think the public sector can do a lot to help. I think actually the way projects are put together could also be standardized, and more documentation could be harmonized. There's quite a lot you could do to bring down some of those barriers. There are aggregator structures. As a bank, we developed an aggregator structure in the UK 3 years ago to bring together some small school building projects into a bigger project that then would attract the interest of a larger investor. That's a very successful. So the aggregator structure exists. So I think that financial technology is there. I take your point about the lack of transparency, and I think, again, the more we can open up procurement processes, the more we can get transparency into the system, the less likely it is for inappropriate practices to be hidden. So yes, I'm with you with transparency. Again, I think the MDB point that was made is a very good one. I mean, the MDBs have been asked to come forward with some principles, perhaps, for how you kind of scale up finance to get to the kind of levels that we need. And this really goes to the heart of, you know, where does the public sector, if you like, the public sector balance sheet, where is it deployed to best effect, you know, to maximize the amount of leverage, and leverage, not lending, is what we would hope that the MDBs would do, because they really can deploy their considerable capacity, could really make the difference. And again, I think they could come together a little bit more and agree on how they do some of this work, how they deploy their risk mitigation instruments and the various techniques they have to bring in that private finance. So I think everyone knows a lot of these problems now. I think there's a real consensus on working towards solutions. We're not there yet, but I think, you know, people are really actively working on this process. And I think the MDBs, for example, are really now trying to come together a little bit more and to standardize and industrialize what they do, because that's the way we're going to get to scale. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Regarding your first question, there are NGOs that are on the name and shame space, and sometimes they do something with this, and the problem is that this space is being reduced in some governments, but there are some that do that kind of work, and transparency is it's like the solution. On the second question, it's interesting. We had the Seize Your Power campaign. It was a divestment and scale up and investments campaign that we made globally, and we learned from it that it was much easier to divest than to scale up investments because of that, because they had atomization of options for institutional investors. But since then, this campaign ended in 2015. Since then, we have seen different developments, interesting developments. And you have the private and the public solution. In the private sector, there, for instance, I've seen business models that work with different renewable energy providers, and they aggregate, and then they can get cheaper capital for those small actors, and in exchange, it's a very intensive work, because it's a large set of of builders or developers of renewable energy, but then they can present that to institutional investors in an interesting manner. Obviously, the work also is about how you hedge the risk of different actors, etc. It's very intensive, but it's going well. It is in California, this case. And on the other hand, you have some energy transition funds that are guaranteeing different investments, and they can act as well as a consolidating entities. But it's a space, I suppose, the market will fill in at some point, but because these new business models, and obviously there is a lot of work to do in different places. Is different, but I think there will be solutions.
Yes, just quickly, you asked the question, what are we doing about those that have a short-term gain and who can do nothing? And at the moment, financial systems are designed to move capital and for capital accretion. And as long as they do that, any action that leads to that outcome is legitimate. And they'll act according to mandates, which you said have be frustrated your actions because they're deeply entrenched in history. So I'm quite interested in looking at models that are emerging now. In the UK, there's an act called the Social Value Act, and it applies to large public procurers like the National Health Service, who have millions and millions at their disposal. And they are required, when making their procurement decisions, to take account of economic, social, and environmental outcomes of their procurement behaviour. And where there is a conflict between them, they must give priority to social and environmental outcomes. Now, imagine if the goal of the financial system was to create value rather than to move and accumulate financial capital. The creation of value would, by definition, have to take account of things beyond this short-termism. Just one final thing on fiduciary duty. I think that there have been some helpful statements about the fact that fiduciary duty can't any longer be used as an excuse not to do things, certainly in the UK and in the US. And CDSB coordinates a statement on fiduciary duty that 160 companies have signed now to say they regard it as their fiduciary duty to take account of natural capital and climate change in their decisions. So I think there is hope, but we need to focus on what we want the system to do and test what people are doing against that objective.
Thank you. So I think we'll take a few more questions and clump them together. So we've got one over here. Anyone else? We can get that other box. No? Okay, let's go.
Thank you. My name is Mark Lutz with WWF. I think it's this development with the task force is, of course, very encouraging, and thank you for your very clear explanations of what's at stake and the importance of it. I think what's even more encouraging is that this isn't the only development in this area. We've got other initiatives going on, the 2-degree investment initiative, the work of the South Pole Group. It's advancing on various fronts, and I'd like to raise one what I think is an important development and see how it connects to this effort. I follow sometimes the Green Climate Fund, and when the Green Climate Fund board was accrediting different entities, implementation entities that receive the funds and present the projects to the Green Climate Fund and receive the funds, they were accrediting a wide range of banks, multilateral development banks, private banks, that have a portfolio that ranges from the quite good to the quite bad. A lot of them were heavily invested in fossil fuels, extractives, pipelines, all that sort of thing. And civil society made some demands that look at these portfolios, and those entities with dirty portfolios should not be accredited, but at least they must be taken into account. And the board made a very, I think is a very interesting decision. They decided, okay, we're going to go ahead and accredit these entities. I think pretty much all the ones that applied were accredited, but in 5 years, when they're up for reaccreditation, we're going to look at their, not just the funds they invest from the Green Climate Fund, we're going to look at their overall portfolio and how much that has shifted towards alignment with the goals of the Green Climate Fund and now the goals of the Paris Agreement, which are very specific in terms of temperature, shifting investments, and that sort of thing. So now the Green Climate Fund has the task of, to fulfill that promise, developing metrics and a methodology for this, which they're starting to work on now. I wonder to what extent the recommendations of the Green Climate Fund, the recommendations of the task force can provide guidance for that, or do we have to look elsewhere? I think they haven't gotten that much into financial institutions, and portfolios of financial institutions are very complex, and probably the methodology will have to reflect some of that complexity. Thanks.
Great question. And we have one over there.
Yes, thank you very much. Asun Sinclair, DMBTL. A very broad question. What do you need from science in order to do the risk assessment, to implement the TCFD recommendations, not only for the financial sector, but also for the corporates? Is the science available, not only in terms of mitigation and greenhouse gases emissions reductions, but also in terms of adaptation and understanding the climate change impacts and resilience?
Right. Do you want to take any of those on? One more. Okay, we'll take one more question. Okay, Gerrit.
Gerrit Hansen from German Watch. Thank you very much, first of all, for all these very insightful comments. I have a bit of a provocative question. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Do you really think that as long as we do not have a meaningful carbon price in place, that via the judging, assessing the climate risk in the financial system is actually going to get us where we need to be?
Great. So we've got something about the materiality and carbon pricing. We've got something around the need. Can the TCFD respond potentially to this innovative decision of the board of the Green Climate Fund? And we've got a question around what's needed from science. So I'll start with Ed, and then anyone else wants to tackle it.
I'll have a crack, and if I can try and draw a thread between all three questions, or my answers to all three questions, well, that's my challenge. So I think carbon pricing is a very interesting case in point, and the point I'd like to make is that while we have increasing numbers of our clients from all sectors creating carbon prices, what we don't have is agreed methodologies to do that work. And we don't necessarily have agreement on scenarios. And so it's why we're strong supporters of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, because under the auspices of the World Bank, that should help us to get to a bit more comparability. So if you've got some agreed methodology, you've got good quality information from the disclosure from the FSB task force, and you've got scenarios that you can test that against, then you should get the carbon pricing should start to reflect the reality, the real carbon intensity, if you like, of those different kinds of enterprise. And the scenarios are where I think the science really should come in. I mean, I think building those scenarios and making much better comparability about what we're really trying to, what is the scenario against which we're testing our analysis. I think that's the role for science. And not just on the Green Climate Fund, we are one of the accredited banks of the Green Climate Fund, as I'm sure you were completely aware when you looked at me when you posed that question. I mean, we're working very constructive way with the Green Climate Fund. We're very keen to do some projects with the Green Climate Fund. We see the Green Climate Fund as a way in which we could do maybe projects that we were thinking about doing, but we could do them perhaps in a greener way. The Green Climate Fund could make the difference between a project being really very, very green and maybe good, but not as good as it could have been. They may also give us the mechanism, if you like, because you work through a national designated authority, gives the mechanism to be able to go and do work in countries, some of which it's difficult to work in currently. So we could perhaps increase scope as well. They have an awful lot on their plate. They're victims of their own success in some respects, given the pipeline now of accreditation applications is is so big that they're going to take at current rates many years, several years before they can get to the end. So I think there is the possibility of other institutions working with some of the accredited partners. And if we can do that, then yeah, we're, as I say, we're very committed to the Green Climate Fund. I think everyone would like it to be able to do more quicker, but it is it's a difficult multilateral kind of construct, and it needs to get up and running, if you like. I mean, it was set up, it didn't have necessarily the resources perhaps that it could have had, and it's been trying to fix that. But lots of the work of a multilateral institution is based on fairly long understanding of its risk appetite and how its processes for decision making. And the Green Climate Fund is a relatively new, a new kid on the block. So we're still committed, and we're very confident that we will be able to do some projects with the GCF going forward, and that we will be able to ensure that our accreditation is a long-term thing, not a short-term thing.
Yes. On the science question, there is a big role for science, of course. The Green Finance Study Group nowadays is developing thinking on the publicly available environmental data. The challenge that a good risk assessment faces with limited data or a lot of data, but not well organized or not maybe in a way that is relevant for financial decisions. So we are really progressing on having geo-referentiated data of different aspects of the environment, and that's great. We need to organize that, put the different layers of information in models that really can feed in public policy decisions. And secondary, or finally, it will be great if they can feed into a Bloomberg screen or something like that. And for that, you need to a lot of research on how this complex and immense data can really get into some simple but representative figure that promotes the best decision making. That is a challenge for science. It's a lot of work, and also gathering information in many countries is still a very primary step. So because we are talking about the globe, and there are parts of the world that are really deeply screened, but there are parts of the world that we need a lot of data still. So there's a big space for science here.
Norbert? Yeah.
Yes, I think there is, as Ed said, a thread that runs between these three questions, and that it seems to be, what do we need to do to induce change? Is there a role for accreditation of bodies participating in the Green Finance Fund and for their periodic reassessment? Is there a role for science? Is there a role for carbon pricing? Yes is the answer. But as Santiago said, I agree, provided that what is done, it is done so as to send signals and evidence to those who need to be influenced, so we can test what they've done against the objective. So an accreditation process should have the objective of ensuring that money has been spent in the way that was originally intended. Science should provide the evidence, the guidance, and the assessment process for determining whether the decisions we're making are correct from a scientific point of view. And similarly with carbon pricing, is it a lever to stop us emitting so much carbon? But really the key thing is how those interventions influence our decision making, and what decisions we are aiming to make, and how we test against our progress towards them.
Thank you for the questions, and I agree to what previous speakers have said already. I think they perfectly fit together. So I think, first of all, disclosure and transparency in the financial market is a very important element to shift financial flows in a more sustainable and climate compatible direction. But by far, it's not sufficient to get there. And therefore, I think there's a point on carbon pricing as one additional element needs to be made very clearly. We need more than just this pillar, which is on the agenda of this side event here today. So carbon pricing, definitely a real carbon pricing which reflects the challenge and the costs of non-action would really be another very important pillar. Coming to this GCF question, I think that's also a very interesting case. So HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Crédit Agricole, among those commercial banks who have been accredited to the GCF. And of course, the NGO community observing that was becoming very nervous. And I think that they rightly did so, because we shouldn't betray ourselves. If we look onto all these very positive developments of green finance, and we see really a good positive development. But on the other hand, we also have to look what else is happening. So by far, much more finance is going in the wrong direction at the same time. And that you can see definitely also with commercial banks. And Ed said, of course, he's depending on the non-financial business to trigger another development. And it's good that the financial sector is going there. And that leads me to the point of science, because I think it is, in my experience, really a problem that we don't have the tools which allow us to look very quickly whether the portfolios are going in the right direction, whether they are meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement. In the Green Finance Fund, we were discussing at that time paradigm shift. We introduced the 2 degrees target in the investment framework, but it's not further operationalized yet. And why is that? Because there is maybe a similar discussion than what we have right now in the task force of financial disclosure, that there is uncertainty how to construct the right scenarios, how to use them and apply them on the financial sector. So I think that it's really big work to be done by the science, but it should be applied science. So what we don't need is to know that we have to go towards 2 degrees. We need to know the tools, the practical tool, the more the practical side of the science, in order to be able to apply that. So, and that would help the GCF Secretariat in implementing this review after 5 years, but it would also help the financial community in order to implement the forward-looking element of the task force, which looks at scenarios, which requests government companies or recommends that governments look at what their impact would be of their portfolios within the next 20 years, and how should they do that? I think this kind of tool is really missing. So I really see there's a role for think tanks, for the science community, maybe for companies like South Pole, to really develop these kind of tools which are applicable, easy applicable to change the directions.
Thank you. Just, we've got a few more minutes. If there's anyone else, questions or comments, otherwise I'll close. Okay, so I'm going to selfishly pick on the things that I thought were interesting to summarize. But I think really, I'm glad that we have a bit of confidence from our German colleague over here. I think that we should utilize that. And that also we need to integrate. I picked up from what you were saying in terms of the divisions, if I can put it that way, within the finance ministers. We should, as a community, be much better at integrating the narrative of the Green Finance Study Group and the TCFD, because if those two things cause a political kind of, we're on this camp and we think those things are great, we as a community that's supporting this work, that work is totally integratable from a narrative perspective. Let's try and not just focus on one, let's focus on both, because there's support for both of those bodies from different governments. I think the private sector taking the lead, I think that is, if you think about being 10 years ago, it's a very interesting idea to even say that. I think the private sector should take the lead. And now that we're saying that, a bit more confidence on this particular issue is quite, I think, interesting. And I think today, today's statement from WBCSD and We Mean Business, really supporting the task force and calling for certain economic measures is one of those those moments. There's also the investor statement and the WEF statement, and then the companies that are coming forward to say they will commit. I think that's really important. I was interested in this notion that, well, not the notion, I was heartened by the fact that we really are starting to have the conversation of breaking down those silos between the different finance communities. And in particular, the fact that the climate finance community is beginning to see, or has seen very, very clearly, that you can focus on the climate finance as much as you like, but if you've gotten rid of the capital loss in the first place from climate change and business as usual no longer exists, your narrative becomes one. And I think the aid community is and the development community is joining that. I think the transparency piece really came through, and I think it was a theme that was woven and linked everything really together. I'm glad you brought up the 2 Degree Investing Initiative. The CDP is working with 2 Degree Investing Initiative and with Oxford in terms of getting asset level data, really getting transparent. And I think that's where you come back to that point. So that power, company that makes that decision to invest in whatever it may be, that's an asset. And what we need is not just company level data. We need to know what your CapEx decisions are, and we need to know where capital is being deployed specifically. And that's quite hard to often untangle, and the asset databases are out there, but they're not necessarily used. And there is a whole kind of focus on bringing that together. I think then that power station can be seen more by investors and by the community that cares about transparency, which pretty much is the civil society backbone. The signals piece was really important. So what are we putting into the carbon pricing question, the question around when we're integrating this, when we're embedding it, we're sending signals. When the Green Climate Fund made that decision, it's almost like forward procurement in government, right? Or when any part of the private sector does forward procurement, you're telling them that we'll buy the particular thing now, but we've got this new really groovy problem that you can't solve now, but you're going to have to solve because that's all we're going to buy in the future. It's the same sort of thing. You're sending a signal that things need to shift in order for you to join this procurement again. And I think that carbon pricing plays a similar role, but think that we should only be companies should not just be looking at explicit carbon pricing signals out there right now. They should also be looking at the fact that carbon related price signals, as I like to call them, are embedded in the economy already. And in certain countries, you could argue the German utilities didn't read the tea leaves pretty well in Germany. And that didn't do, decent for their investors and shareholders. So investors and companies need to get better at, in terms of the scenario analysis, at reading all of those signals that places a price into the economy. And even if they think that right now we don't have the right level of explicit pricing, there's quite a bit of implicit pricing, and they could use carbon pricing, and I think you were alluding to that, Ed, as a metric themselves. And I think governments can do that against sense checking their policies, against their procurement commitments on infrastructure. So carbon pricing needs to kind of come out of this box in a way, and be used as a sign, as I suppose as a tool, as a metric to price a broad range of risks that are already out there in the economy. And more and more private sector think that while those explicit sizes, signal strengths will not be so high now, they will be in, say, 10 years' time. And in any infrastructure investment, you should be taking that into account now. So, and we are leading on a problem with actually HSBC and a few other folk in the room with the private sector to actually try and measure and say, well, this is your corridor that you need to be able to sense check those investments. And again, just coming back, Norbert brought us back very, very clearly that even with all of that, it's absolutely fundamental we keep that Paris Agreement on the agenda in all the multilateral discussions. That's our goal. That's the outcome we're aiming to seek. And now let's have science turn that into tangible indicators, tangible scenarios. But it's the ultimate goals of the Paris Agreement that we're aiming to achieve. So thank you very much to the panel. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for joining us, and can leave.